Our first speaker today is Claire Elsdon, who leads the capital markets team at CDP. Claire defines the NGA's engagement strategy with financial institutions and other capital markets actors, helping to amplify calls for improved transparency on environmental data, in addition to helping financial institutions utilise the data that CDP make available on climate, water and forest impacts. If we could welcome Claire to the stage. Thank you.
Great. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for that kind introduction. And it's a real pleasure and privilege to be with you here today. It's no small achievement that we're doing this in part live again after COVID. So it's great to be back in the room with you all today. So thank you, Kate, for that generous introduction. CDP is a really interesting one. Our name is an acronym that refers back to our heritage of being the Carbon Disclosure Project. We're a non-profit that started just over 20 years ago with a very simple theory of change, and it really relates back to people in this room, which is that people who invest in companies really have a need to understand what is the impact of those companies on the planet and how will those companies be impacted by planetary changes. Excuse me. But that question in itself cannot be answered without data. Because as we all know, you can't manage what you're not measuring. So our founders 23 years ago came up with this very simple principle of, well, in that case, we need to find the data. How do we find the data? And the solution in their minds was to set out a questionnaire for companies to fill out, to respond to these questions around how are you impacting the planet? How is the planet impacting your business operations? So that we can then start to understand what level of risk and opportunity that we're looking at. The reason why CDP at the time had any authority to be asking the world's biggest companies to undertake that exercise is because we had the support of asset owners and asset managers globally who supported us in collecting that information. So first of all, just a big thank you to Greenbank and to everyone in this room who is appreciating and using the data and supporting us in being able to do that and shine that light of transparency on operations. So to come to the point about why are we called CDP? Well, CDP was fundamentally in the beginning about a carbon disclosure project, but very quickly we realised you can't just look at carbon in isolation. Nothing relating to the climate does happen in isolation, and I'm delighted that in this room today we are dedicating the time to talk about water. As we all know, none of these planetary changes that we're observing happen in isolation, and they're all deeply intertwined and interlinked. Last year we just saw the first year of achieving, unfortunately, 1.5 degrees of warming. And that is having a flywheel effect on the changes that we're seeing to the hydrological cycle, not an easy word to say in a hurry. And that is impacting where the world's fresh water is being allocated in terms of extreme drought, extreme floods, are seeing an escalation in the frequency of those events and indeed the severity of those events. So what that's meaning for businesses is changing rapidly. And companies that started disclosing to us 12 years ago, in terms of the dedicated water questionnaire that we've been sending out, have been quickly getting to grips with, what does this mean for my business? Last year, we saw almost 5,000 companies reporting to CDP on this question, which is really great, but we've still got quite a bit more to do, because overall, last year, 20,000 companies responded to CDP on the climate questionnaire, which refers back to the old carbon-related questions. So as you can see, roughly a quarter of companies are starting to really dedicate the time and attention, on this important issue, but we've got a way to go. So in terms of some of the key takeaways I really want to share with you today, a lot of these will be hinging around a report that we actually just published last month, which really takes a deep dive into a subject area which goes into companies from any sector and how they're managing water specifically within their supply chains, which up till now has been an area which has been slightly ignored and overlooked when people are thinking about water-related risk. Generally, when people are thinking about that, they'll often think about stranded assets, maybe flood-related risk in direct operations. Where are your factories based? Where are your operations based? Where are your people based? But actually, in reality, the story is far more complex than that. So I'm really delighted to share with you some of the insights that we've gleaned from this year's disclosure experience. And we've actually taken findings from just around 3,000 companies, 2,500, sorry, who've disclosed to us over the last 3 years. And we're starting to see the trends emerging in terms of what they're reporting over that period of time. So again, to set the scene a little bit here, we've just seen 1.5 degrees being broken through. That, as I said, is devastating in terms of seeing that impact on the hydrological cycle. We've seen parts of the Rhine in 2023 closed for shipping due to heavy rains. At the same time, the Panama Canal has grappled with severe drought. We've seen floods halting industrial production in Japan, and water scarcity in Taiwan has threatened the global supply of semiconductors, which underpin our digital economy. Now, this is the first point I really want to be clear on. A lot of people, when we're talking about water-related risk, will say, oh, that's an agricultural story, right? Because we all know that clearly to get crops out of the ground requires a lot of water. So really this is a story about farming and maybe food production. Well, yes, it certainly is relevant to that sector, but it's actually much broader than that. For me, it was pretty shocking to see what was happening in Taiwan last year around semiconductor production. There was severe droughts happening there. UMC is a major chip producer who report to CDP, and they give us some pretty alarming stories in terms of their requirements that they faced to bring in temporary water supplies into their operations in order for them to be able to continue with chip production. And that's just one small element of the risk that we're seeing. But given that we know that directionally we have people globally getting wealthier, we have increasing GDP, we have an increasing demand for chips, but also the complexity of chips means that the requirement on water per chip is only increasing. So if we're expecting that the world may be saved by technology, well, that's unfortunately a thirsty sector too. And so we need to be really mindful about the widespread nature of these water-related risks. So when we're thinking about supply chains, here's the good news, because I'm not here just to give you a lot of bad news. There is some good news as well. When we're thinking about supply chains, what I've really noticed, and I've been at CDP for 5 years now and spent the bulk of the rest of my career in finance, in equity sales actually. But when I first joined CDP, a lot of companies were thinking about their climate-related risks and opportunities, but not really focusing on supply chain so much. Now, one of the few benefits that have come through as a result of the awful COVID pandemic is that has really shone a light on the resiliency or not of supply chains. And so we started to see more companies considering what trade routes, what dependencies look like, and how that is impacting the resiliency of their businesses and their ability to produce. So in terms of the report I'm referring to now, it's called Stewardship at the Source. So if you want to refer back to it, it's free online on the CDP website. And by all means, enjoy that for some bedtime reading later on. But for now, to give you some of those highlights. So around 4,815 companies disclosed water-related data through CDP last year. And overall, 50% of companies globally are seeing 50% of the water footprint of high-income economies is from areas of the global south facing extreme water insecurity. So already straight away you can see that we've got quite a significant issue there in terms of dependencies and an assumption quite often built out of the fact that water is generally priced very, very cheaply. It's one of the cheapest resources that businesses and indeed people can access if they're fortunate enough to access it. It's fundamentally mispriced. So quite often businesses will operate assuming the value of water being the cost price. And that is the first problem that we've got. So really understanding that actually the value of water is far more wide-reaching than that. And actually, if we really give it its full value as a dependency in the supply chain picture, things start to look a little bit different. So there are 3 areas when we look at this report where we're seeing companies really getting to grips with this problem and taking some critical steps. And I think it's helpful to share them with you so that you can start to think about what good looks like with leading companies. And hopefully that's where your investments are aligned or aligning. So firstly, companies that are doing well are taking action to make risk and impact assessments on their supply chains. So 40% of companies who disclosed to us last year were responding in terms of giving us information on understanding and assessing risk in their supply chains. And 25% are assessing the impact on water. So that's companies like BMW, Dr. Pepper, and so on. So really big global companies there. One of the reasons why companies are getting on the front foot with that, again, things are changing fast, but there is pressure on companies to really start understanding their footprint. We've got big initiatives, and prepare yourself for some acronyms. We've got some big initiatives coming through that are affecting companies and the reporting requirements that are upon them. So TNFD is one you may well have heard of. That's the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. There are fresh requirements coming through in terms of companies understanding the impacts and dependencies on nature, water being a key part of that. And also the Science-Based Targets for Nature, SBTN, which is around target setting around nature, which we'll get onto separately. But those things are really starting to focus attention. So when companies are running that assessment, what are they actually looking at? Well, generally, this is a complex field and more nuanced than considering emissions. Emissions are, in a sense, and I say this with a great deal of sensitivity and caution, fairly simple. It boils down to a number in terms of emissions. With water, it is a local problem. And we mustn't ever get into the situation of considering that a litre of water in one geography or one water basin has an equivalency to a litre of water anywhere else in the world. It's a very local, very specific issue, but it is measurable. That's the good news. So companies making that assessment will consider what degree of water pollution they are impacted by and creating, their level of water withdrawals at a basin level. So with CDP disclosures, they do actually report at a facility and basin level what their withdrawals look like. As well as the status of the basin in which they're operating. So in terms of the water stress that water basin is experiencing and the overall availability of water. They'll also touch on wash services, so thinking really about the social elements around sanitation and health and water availability for local communities, which is also incredibly important. The equity of how water is shared around is a very significant issue, and there have been instances in the past, Coca-Cola in India being one of them, where there was a perception of egregious withdrawals of water by the local community. Coca-Cola actually lost their license to operate for a significant period of time in that jurisdiction. So those social issues matter, of course, on a human level, but can also manifest very directly in a business operational sense as well. Got an interesting little snippet of a case study here. So Tesco are a company that are running these risk assessments. So they've mapped their fresh supply chains and a number of key commodities using the WWF water risk filter, which is a tool that's available to them, to understand which supply chains are the most dependent on water and where the biggest impacts and risk areas are. So that's informing their landscape scale engagement and their potential future alignment for the reporting, but also really just considering where the risks lie in their supply chains. So that's the sort of the key thing is for companies to really understand what is my state of play now. So a good question for you to be considering with your investments is, to what extent are the companies that I'm investing in doing exactly that thing? Because that is step one in future-proofing their business and making sure they're doing the right thing. Step two is for companies to be considering those water-related risks and impacts and then actually setting targets for improvement. This is critical. So this is a key element in enabling those companies to set a direction to aim for and serve as benchmarks for evaluating performance. This is also a key element for enabling those teams to facilitate buy-in from senior management and then mobilising resources from across the organisation to make that a priority. So in 2023, unfortunately, only 4% of 3,163 companies globally that reported to us were setting water-related targets specifically for their supply chain. So that is a glaring area for improvement and tells you a great deal about the overall level of maturity on this subject. This, for me, feels like a code red and really needs some attention. So there are some companies, this is the good news, there's always some, that are doing this well already. So Burberry, Capri Holdings, Levi Strauss, Kering and LVMH are already on board. And they've really been assisted by some big initiatives that exist out there. Companies are not having to think about everything from the word go. Things do exist to support this process. There's the Roadmap to Zero program, for example, which really underpins that multi-stakeholder approach and enabling companies to really champion change within their supply chains. We're also seeing other reporting requirements like CSDDD, which are also requiring that more of these companies take exactly these steps. So the overall backdrop is supportive, but action needs to be prioritised. So one example of a target, just to get really practical, LVMH, the luxury goods brand, has set a target to reduce water withdrawal by 30% by 2030. So that's really important for key activities, including vineyard irrigation, cotton cultivation, leather and wool production, as well as processing and precious metal extraction and processing, forgive me. So lastly, and I've just slightly alluded to this one, on critical steps that need to be taken, companies need to be incentivising executive action. So we've seen massive progress in terms of C-suite incentives around climate-related goals. And we've now got 60% of the FTSE 100 with an ESG measure in executive pay. So that's very positive. But when we really drill down into considerations around water-related risk, we've seen that 14% of companies reporting via CDP say that they have C-suite or board-level incentives in place for the management of supply chain water-related issues. So a good start, but again, we need to see more being done there. So again, that's a question that I'd be asking companies, what their strategies are for tackling these areas. A lot of those targets will fall to the Chief Procurement Officer, and that's usually a very critical, understandably, individual responsible for a lot of these considerations. And again, to give you a sense of which companies are doing well here so far, we've got names like Coca-Cola, Kao, Wistron Corporation and L'Oreal all offering financial incentives, which is great to see. But on the other side of the coin, and I'm mindful of time, so I'll make these some of my concluding comments, it's helpful to think about what's the other side of the coin. It's one thing to set targets and to engage supply chains, but what if suppliers are in a position in which they're actually going to struggle to respond to these things? It's one principle to say you must do these things and we're your buyer, so get it done. But that's not really a very intelligent way of working. So one of the things that we're seeing is really considering how benefits in terms of access to markets, but also access to support more broadly can be offered by some of the leading companies when they're considering water risk in their supply chains. So again, we're seeing companies like AstraZeneca, Burberry, Johnson & Johnson, to name a few, integrating water into codes of conduct, which apply to all of their suppliers. And they have compliance measures in place to monitor through regular assessment and auditing programs. So on the one hand, that's a very clear signal of this is a requirement for doing business with us. On the flip side, we're also seeing some really strong innovation and collaboration in terms of ways in which suppliers can be supported through education, for example, and other measures. So Nestlé has worked alongside the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation to train around 50,000 farmers on best irrigation practices in Vietnam. And that's resulted in 50 million cubic metres of water being saved annually and generating more than $8 million in the local economy of smallholder coffee farmers. So for me, that's really essential because this isn't a story about cutting off suppliers, especially from developing markets where that water stress is really particularly significant. It's about working with and taking that supply chain with them. Because ultimately, if nothing happens and this water stress ends up manifesting directly in the earnings profiles of the companies at the group level, that is going to be a cost. And so there's an assessment that needs to be made around where should that investment come? How do we anticipate and future-proof our supply chains by working with willing suppliers as much as possible and supporting them through measures that provide the capacity building and sometimes also nudges and support measures when it comes to finance. My last comment will be one of the things I've personally been really excited to see in my role, and we work with asset owners and asset managers, but also banks, is to see some banks out there starting to offer sustainability-linked supplier financing for suppliers of major companies, sorry for the noise, who are reaching and reporting certain KPIs through their CDP disclosures. So we've seen that, for example, with Walmart and HSBC several years ago. HSBC worked with Walmart to support them on their Project Gigaton initiative, which was all around emissions reductions in their portfolios. And I can say as a privileged, of course, but also pained homeowner who's seen my mortgage cost roughly double, more or less, over the last year, the cost of capital is a very real concern and issue for individuals, but also businesses. So I think these measures that can be put in place around incentivising disclosure, improving performance, is really essential for providing the access to capital and discounted capital to businesses. So we are working with some banks to explore ways in which some of those KPIs can actually be linked to water-related disclosures in supply chains to act as an incentive for suppliers to be prioritising this as a way forward. And of course, not just providing that nudge with a discount, but also offering financing to implement some of the solutions that need to be put in place that require some CapEx. So anyway, that was a very quick canter through what we're seeing on the water landscape. By all means, please access the report. Like I say, it's free to download from our website. But I'm really excited to be here today and interested to see the rest of the conversation. So thank you.